Another major headline, of course, that we're following closely has to do with the fact that Iran has chosen a new supreme leader. So we're taking a look here at a social media post from a reporter courtesy of Reuters. Phil Stewart says this, that Iran names Khamenei's son, Mojtaba, as new supreme leader, a state media report. Iran's Assembly of Experts has named him to replace his father as the country's new supreme leader. Again, state media reported that on Sunday. So a lot to get to in terms of where this conflict is right now. To do that, I'd like to bring into the conversation now Janatan Sayeh. He is the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies Iran Program Research Analyst. Janatan, good morning. Good to see you.
Hi, great to be with you again.
So a lot of developments over the weekend, and we're going to touch on all of them. The first one has to be this: the new supreme leader named in Iran. We've been following this for the last several days. We thought it would be Khamenei's son. So really, what comes next in terms of this political dynamic? How's it going to change how operations are being handled right now?
I do remember speaking with you about this about a week ago. So it's interesting that it was this predictable for us to know that supreme leader succession is going to pursue the hereditary path. That's something that the Islamic Republic objected to, even founded an Islamic revolution against any sort of hereditary succession. And look where they are right now. So it has really two major implications. Number one, it implies that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the main ideological and military wing of the Islamic Republic, the same entity that has been leading the war efforts against the United States, has again prevailed to shape Iran's internal politics. Because without the IRGC support, the supreme leader could not have been chosen. We know for a fact that they have elections, I guess, on paper, but we know what happens behind the scenes, the influence of the armed forces. So that's really one. And two, you have to look at Mojtaba as a person. You know, he embodies all the values that his father preached and all the malign characteristics of the Islamic Republic. He's a well-known kleptocrat with a financial empire. He has great ties to the repression forces that have killed and brutalized the Iranians. He has influenced Iranian politics to shape them the way he wants them to be conducted, and many other pillars. So when you look at it and you have to assume how the Washington-Tehran relationship is going to look like, by no means an improvement, because if anything, he might even be more hardline than his father on some of these stances. We know how close he is with certain wings of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So by no means is Tehran suggesting compromise over escalation right now. The message is very clear to the United States that Iran will not be providing concessions of any sorts during this war period.
You know what's interesting, Janatan, is that even though we had pretty much predicted, and really several experts, that this was going to be the path of succession here for the new Iranian supreme leader, I was under the impression that, you know, now Mojtaba does have a target on his back. So they were being a little hesitant in naming him as the successor. So what does that tell us about how important it is to actually have a supreme leader established there in Iran?
It is crucial. And Mojtaba is not going to be the only one with a target on his back. Anyone, if they were to be selected as supreme leader, would have to go through the same threats. And again, these the threats of elimination and targeted assassination is not limited just to the supreme leader apparatus. It goes beyond that. All of them are in hiding effectively. So that was not going to change regardless. As to what it really tells us about how internal politics works in the Islamic Republic. So as we noted, we talked about the role of the IRGC in all this. But at the end of the day, given that it's an ideological and theocratic state, the Islamic Republic still wants a religious or a cleric to legitimize military rule. So this is not to say a role of a cleric or an ayatollah is going to diminish the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' role in the politics. It more so justifies it, because now the armed forces can point to a theocrat and say it is because of this entity that my rule is legitimate, because I'm defending the Islamist values that is preached by the clergy. So that's a crucial thing there. It's mostly for internal purposes and really for the support base outside of Iran, because we have to remember so many of the followers of the Islamic Republic have ideological leanings, and because of that they want to see a spiritual leader as much as they want to see a military leader. So it's two roles that the supreme leader has to fulfill amongst many other things. But again, this is really not to say that for some reason his rule is going to be able to override the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, but it tells us that the regime does not at least overtly want to appear as a military dictatorship. They still want to maintain this facade that they're somehow pursuing or advancing an Islamist agenda worldwide.
Jonathan, on the screen, I've had these live looks out of there in Beirut. So this is the scene right now, but I do want to show some of these images that we had earlier on today. So for any of our viewers that are tuning in now, you're going to pay attention to the left-hand side of your screen here. You can see a blast there and a strike. You're going to see a lot of smoke coming up as well. This brings me back to some major developments from over the weekend, Jonathan, in terms of the fact that Iran has conducted this was an Israeli strike, though, I believe, because this is there in Beirut. And we know that Israeli military targeting Hezbollah infrastructure. So that's specifically this feed. But going back to some of the operations for Iran, we saw them also conduct strikes against several Gulf nations. I want to get some background context to this, Jonathan. When it comes to how Iran is approaching this, and we look at history, does it surprise you to see that Iran is also conducting strikes against all of these Gulf nations as well? And how is that affecting the relationship at the moment?
It surprised me with certain countries, but the strategy as a whole is something that Tehran has threatened for decades. They've repeatedly stated that should there be a war against the Islamic Republic, the implications of that conflict is going to spread throughout the region, and they've threatened even throughout the world. So that has been their strategy, to inflict as much cost as possible against their adversaries, to create an image of chaos and really ensure that any war would lead to so much instability in the region, would implicate the energy market to the extent that it would deter the continuation of that attack by the adversary. That said, that has not played out how the Islamic Republic wanted it to. So we have to really narrow down whom the Islamic Republic is targeting in this particular context. Some, of course, are evidently adversaries of the regime. You're talking about, for example, Saudi Arabia, UAE to a great extent. Of course, some of these states have never been necessarily overtly hostile to Iran in the last few years. But that said, they were far from partners. They were certainly rivals. But then it really comes down to two countries I'm thinking about, Qatar and Turkey. And actually, third one would be Azerbaijan. These three states, not only have they not really put pressure on the Islamic Republic. I know they have their own competition in other areas, but if you look at what Doha and Ankara did, Turkey and Qatar, they both actually sought to facilitate talks between Tehran and Washington. They were really lobbying against any attack on the Islamic Republic here in DC. So to see that how they were bombed, although they were the ones that were trying to mediate between the two, I think even threw them off as well. You see what the Qataris stated recently, saying we felt backstabbed, we felt betrayed by the Islamic Republic. So it has two major implications. One, Iran is dragging neutral states into the conflict. But going beyond that, it is actually turning friends against it. Not to call these two countries allies of Iran. But that said, they were strategic partners. They cooperated a lot in numerous fronts, diplomatically, terror financing, money laundering. But all of a sudden, they find themselves being targets of the regime aggression. And that by no means is helpful, and it's going to further isolate Tehran.
Another country that I want to focus on here in this discussion is Oman, because we know that recently Omani mediators were the ones that were trying to get down to a deal between the U.S. and Iran over its nuclear program. Oman, another country that's been caught in the crossfires. Is Oman still trying to have diplomatic channels in the background? Are they trying to de-escalate? How have they responded to this?
Surprisingly, they still are. Of course, they have not been struck as aggressively as other countries. But that said, Oman was the main mediator. I mean, it is the Switzerland of the Middle East in terms of diplomacy, at least. Very neutral, does not get involved in anything, always facilitates talks, does not have an aggressive foreign policy in any capacity. Still, they were attacked. And what's really notable is that comparing the statements coming from Omani officials versus Qatari and Saudi Arabian officials, even though they were bombed, despite their efforts, they're still trying to facilitate talks, which really you have to ask yourself, do they not recognize that this regime is not only is not acting on rational ideologies, but really is pursuing a religious zealot-like agenda? You can't really treat some of these diplomats as if they're representing a normal country. The role of ideology here cannot be undermined. So I think we're all surprised to see how Oman is still appeasing the regime in Tehran.
Jonathan, then that begs the question, is Iran still possibly trying to balance this risk of the escalation that's happening with not trying to provoke a larger coalition response? Let's say if all of these Gulf countries get together and possibly forge stronger partnerships with countries in the West, such as Europe and the U.S.
It's an interesting way to think about it. So, yeah, I mean, in theory, I would agree to your point that no country would want a stronger coalition against it. That would strategically make a lot of sense. But in this case, you're talking about the strongest military in the world, paired with one of the strongest intelligence wings in the world, U.S. military and the Israeli Mossad, waging war against the Islamic Republic. So really, for the regime, that threshold has passed. They're already dealing with the strongest and toughest enemy. So I guess from their perspective is that the more they can play the victim internationally and the more they can show their support base to say, see, it is not only Israel and America, it is the entire world against our righteous regime in Tehran. That might appease their support base to an extent, but I do agree with you that none of this is going to improve anything in their favor. So it's really interesting to see how the role of ideology, even in a state actor, would prevent them from behaving rationally.
We have to talk a little bit about some of the impacts to civilians that are there on the ground. Iran is targeting some critical infrastructure points there around these Gulf states. So what are some of the biggest impacts and some of the biggest challenges that civilians are going to be facing now, but also in the coming days?
That has been something Tehran has conducted throughout the decades. They know they don't have the capabilities to really go after targeted assassinations of Western officials because they tried and they failed. All their plots were foiled. Because of that, the way that they're going to inflict more cost is going after civilians and indiscriminately bombing. Usually used to be Israel, but now you're seeing that in Dubai. So the image is coming out of such an international location, such as Dubai. There's so many people from different parts of the world that live there. They engage in, of course, finance. That's a big like economic angle of living in Dubai. So you look at all these features, and to see how the regime has been bombing them, I think that's one major pillar that is leading to all these international condemnations. Had the regime not behaved like that, I think, for example, the UN or the EU would have been more reluctant to go and condemn the Islamic Republic. But now they have no choice. And of course, yeah, pursuing any form of civilian death has been the Islamic Republic's major strategy. Whether that has worked in their favor or not, definitely not, because we saw that they supported the October 7th attack and they financed it, and we know for a fact they knew about it. And probably this is why the regime is in the situation that is right now. So the post-October 7th world, something that Tehran led, is now really firing back against it like it never has before.
Right, Jonathan. So a lot of major developments we followed throughout the weekend, including the fact that a new supreme leader has been named. Before I let you go, what are you watching out for closely? What are you keeping an eye on? And really, what is the most important thing that you think viewers should know, as it does seem that this entire scenario is only going to escalate?
The key thing for Washington and Jerusalem to keep in mind during this campaign is how they're messaging to the main leverage against the regime, which is the Iranian people. So any form of communication, whether it's strategic or whether it's covert, overt, no matter how they're going about it, it comes down to how you're ensuring that the masses of Iranians are going to be, if not approving the strikes, at best indifferent. That is very important. And in that process, of course, you want to signal to Iran's national identity. Any talks about fragmentation, balkanization, and sectarian and ethnocentric policies is going to have major ramifications. And any attacks against major infrastructure. So we're not talking about oil silos or like oil warehouses, is more so about oil refineries. So any targeted strikes against the major infrastructures, like I noted, would of course risk alienating the Iranian public. I think that's what I'm looking out for the most. On the military side, I'm interested to see what would the next phase of the war look like, or how close we are to that. Because a lot of us had predicted that the military angle would soon be over, and it seems like we're headed that way. So the next 48 hours are going to be critical, because Iran's ran out of missiles. They don't have the same retaliatory capabilities that they did. So I think we're entering the new phase of how they're going to use a resistance or the anti-regime movement inside Iran against the regime.
Janatan Sayeh, an Iran program research analyst at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. We always appreciate your time here at LiveNOW from Fox. Lots to keep up with. We'll catch up with you soon. Take care.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.